The movie begins with the protagonist, who is a Scottish pilot named Captain Brodie Torrance, getting ready for a flight. We start to understand a little about Captain Brodie when he introduces himself to his co-pilot for this flight. Brodie has a daughter, but his wife passed away 3 years prior. He is a caring man, and he takes his time to get to know a little about his young co-pilot, who shows him a photo of his young family. They discuss how being a pilot is hard when they must spend so much time away from their families. A flight coordinator appears in the cockpit to tell them they are ready to go, but Brodie has some reservations. He is seeing that there is bad weather forming. He voices his concerns, but the flight coordinator ignores him and tells them they will be fine if they fly above the weather and take a shortcut. Brodie doesn't look convinced but obeys. Brodie then goes through all his flight checks and introduces himself to Bonnie, the lead flight attendant. He is polite and professional to everyone. Bonnie tells him he is wanted by some passengers. Brodie walks out of the cockpit and a few passengers stand in the doorway of the plane. The man in front explains he is a marshal and is transporting a criminal. Immediately, Brodie feels on guard. The marshal explains his prisoner committed homicide 15 years ago. Brodie tells the marshal to keep him separate from all the passengers. The marshal agrees respectfully. Brodie returns to his cheerful self and speaks to the passengers from the cockpit, confirming they are flying to Tokyo, and tells them to buckle their seats as they get ready for takeoff. Everything goes to plan until they start to experience quite a lot of turbulence. Brodie and his co-pilot communicate to Trailblazers headquarters that they are going above the weather, and for a few moments, everything smooths out. Unfortunately, this is short-lived, as they experience an almighty bang as lightning strikes the plane and cuts all power. Brodie and his co-pilot are now flying blind, with no communication with the ground, no dashboard power to read their altitude, and no GPS to see where they are and where they are heading. Brodie, though extremely alarmed, keeps everyone calm by speaking calmly to his co-pilot and informing him that they are flying blind, and he gives him instructions to make an estimate of where they are on a map and to form some idea of where they could make a landing. The co-pilot tells Brodie where he thinks they are. Based on this, Brodie turns the plane slightly to find some land, but all that is beneath them is ocean. They are losing so much altitude that it becomes apparent to them that they are going to have to crash land, and Brodie regrettably tells Bonnie to let the passengers know to brace for impact. Bonnie tells the passengers and then buckles herself in, as does her fellow flight attendant. The marshal and the prisoner put their heads down ready, and the prisoner requests his handcuffs be undone, but the marshal refuses. Suddenly, the marshal loses his grip on his phone, which flies halfway down the walkway between seats. He gets up to grab it, as the flight attendants yell at him to remain seated. He doesn't listen, so the other flight attendant unbuckles her belt to help him. Bonnie tells her to stop, but it is too late, as the plane makes a huge lurch and they both go flying. The flight attendant cracks her neck on a seat and the marshal also hits the ceiling, then falls to the floor. Time is running out as the plane loses more and more altitude, until they are barely minutes away from crashing into the ocean. Just when Brodie is getting himself mentally ready to crash into the ocean, he sees some land ahead and he fights with all his might and focus to keep the plane up and out of the water to attempt the crash landing on land. There are trees and bushland beneath them. A little further ahead he sees a dirt road and he encourages his co-pilot to get ready to crash land on this dirt track. They are out of time, and they work together to do their best. They crash land onto the dirt road, all in one piece. Brodie and his co-pilot pause for a moment in sheer relief, but realize they need to get the passengers off right away, just in case the hot fuel and plane catch on fire. Brodie exits the cockpit and tells all the passengers to get off quickly. The passengers are bewildered, frightened and angry from the experience they have just had, but they do as they are instructed to. Meanwhile, at Trailblazers headquarters in New York, a team has formed to try and find out where Flight 119 has gone down. A senior member of Trailblazers named Scarsdale requests all the information he can get about the flight and its last communications, so they can pinpoint where they might be. Back on the island, Brodie tells the passengers to make sure they share their food, and that he is leaving to find the facility he and his co-pilot noticed when they were landing. Hopefully there is a phone there, or a radio that can be used to call for help. The passengers are frightened, but he reassures them they will be okay. He takes Lewis, the prisoner, with him, promptly uncuffing him. Lewis is surprised by this, but doesn't complain. Both take off into the shrubland. As they walk along, Lewis explains to him he is ex-military, from the French Legion. Brodie tells Lewis he went through the marshal's stuff. Lewis then asks if he brought the gun with him, but Brodie doesn't reply. Brody turns around to look at Lewis, but he is gone. Brody shakes his head to himself, most likely thinking that he should have known he would run away. Brody presses on to reach the building he saw. It's a very old, broken down building, with vines and grass growing out of it. He walks in and notices lots of bullet shell casings on the floor. He is extremely nervous and gets out the gun he took from the marshal's bag. He ascends the stairs and is excited to see there are several old telephones. He checks the line, but it is flat, so he attempts to rewire the console next to the phone and then tries the phone again. This time it has a dial tone, so he rings Trailblazers headquarters to tell them where he is. A lady answers, but does not believe he is the captain of Flight 119, because she has been getting prank calls all day. Brody becomes frustrated and asks her to connect him to her superiors, but she will not, thinking it is a prank call. She asks him for his employee number, but he can't give it to her because his card is on the plane. He hangs up and decides to ring his daughter instead. The line is not great, but his daughter can hear him. He tells her to be calm and listen to him and to pass on the following info to Trailblazer. He tells her they have landed on an island in the Holo cluster, but doesn't know exactly which island they are on. As he says this, a man begins to attack him from behind, causing him to drop the phone. Brody and the stranger engage in an intense physical battle. The man has a knife and tries to stab Brody. In the struggle, Brody tries to use the cord of the phone to wrap around the man, but breaks the telephone off the wall, ruining any more communication attempts. Brody manages to get him in a hold and breaks his neck. Brody is left exhausted, trying to catch his breath, until he hears someone coming up the stairs. He hides behind a desk in the room, but he hears the man call him captain and tell him that he can come out. He is shocked to see it is Lewis standing there with 2 rifles, one in his arm and one over his shoulder. Lewis nonchalantly tells him he disabled 2 more men that were heading up the stairs after Brody. Lewis and Brody head to the ute that the men pulled up in and use it to head back to the passengers, fearing for their safety. Back at the plane, the passengers see several cars and utes driving towards them and they run up to them, thinking they are there to rescue them. The co-pilot tells them to be careful, because they do not know who they are. Brody and Lewis have made it back to the passengers, but have been hiding in the bushes watching as the separatist group arrives. The leader of the separatist group, Jun Mar, and his men have come to interrogate the passengers. They ask them where their captain is. The co-pilot explains he went to find a phone and then one of the men slits one of the passengers' throats and tells them to get on the bus. Brody wants to run out at them in sheer rage, but Lewis holds him back. When they leave with the passengers on a bus, they sneak up on 2 of Junmar's men who have been left behind and question them as to where they took the passenger. They use force to get answers out of him and he tells them they took them to Dandulin village. Back at Trailblazers headquarters, Scarsdale and the team listen to the recording of the call that Brody made to Trailblazer. Upon hearing he is somewhere in the Holo Island cluster, Scarsdale arranges a private asset of military to get ready to parachute in once they get more of a precise location. On the island, Brody gets back on the plane. He checks the power, and it is working again. He gets out his iPad to look at the map of Holo, to see where Dandulin is, and leaves a message for the military to let them know where the passengers are and where to find him. He writes the message on the back of his pilot's shirt and hangs it on the console of the plane. Brody hears gunshots and sees Lewis walk out of the shrubs by himself. Brody and Lewis hop into a jeep that the 2 men were using and get ready to go after the passenger. Back at Trailblazers headquarters, through satellite they find the plane, and Scarsdale sends the coordinates to his private asset military to parachute in. The military team arrive on site and inspect the plane, see the message and report back to Trailblazers that they are heading there now. Brody and Lewis arrive just outside of Dandulin village and approach as quietly as they can, disarming several men on the way to where the passengers are held in a cage. Brody grabs the keys from a guard they disarmed and opens the door, while Lewis disarms another guard. They lead them to the bus and load them in, but Lewis explains there are a whole group of armed men he cannot disable on his own. Brody, showing great courage, decides to give himself up to them as a distraction, while the passengers drive themselves out on the bus. He approaches the group and asks to speak to Jun Mar. Jun Mar comes out of a house and Brody tries to explain all they wanted was to use a phone and they didn't want any trouble. Jun Mar has his men beat Brody and tell him the passengers are his people now, because he owns everything on the island. Jun Mar orders one of his men to execute Brody, but just as he aims the gun, the military starts shooting and disabling the men. Brody can hardly believe his luck as a military man grabs him by his arm and leads him back to the bus, and orders one of the passengers to drive off. They manage to get away, but they all know they don't have much time before Junmar comes after them. Brody and his co-pilot tell the passengers that their best chance of surviving is to get back on the plane and to fly as far as they can. Brody orders them back on the plane and they all get ready for takeoff. Lewis and the military stand guard, ready to attack if Junmar's men come as they get ready. Brody and his co-pilot get ready for takeoff, starting the plane up. Junmar's men arrive, and a shootout occurs between the military and Junmar's group. The military take out many of Junmar's vehicles and men, and Brody tells the military to get on the plane as they begin moving down the dirt road. The military men do, but Lewis doesn't join them. He found a bag of money and took off into the shrubs. The plane is gaining speed and Junmar's remaining men continue to shoot at it. Brody sees Lewis hiding in the shrub and shooting at Junmar's other men, but knows he can't go back for him. Junmar has placed himself ahead in the middle of the road, so Brody tells his co-pilot to set the plane to maximum speed. Junmar has a gun ready to aim it at the front of the plane, but the plane knocks him and his car flat before he can shoot, as it plummets into him and lifts off the ground immediately after. Finally, they are in the air and the passengers sit stiffly in fear. The plane will not get far, but Brody and his co-pilot push it as far as they can, shutting off one engine as it fails. Brody contacts Trailblazers headquarters and orders them to tell him his closest runway. They find one a mere 50 miles away on the next island. The plane shudders and loses altitude over the water, but the runway is visible, and Brody tells everyone to brace for impact again. With a very rough landing, Brody lands the plane on the small runway, and everyone cheers as they know they are safe, and off the island without a government. Within minutes, first aid arrives with a rescue team, and they tend to the passengers. Brody receives hugs from Bonnie, his flight attendant, and his co-pilot, and he remains on the plane for a few minutes, overcome with extreme emotion after the huge ordeal they have all been through. With immense relief, he gets up and walks down the plane's steps, sitting on them to ring his daughter and with laughingly tell her, he may be late, but he is coming home.